Bismillah, in fierce hand-to-hand fighting. Now the oven is getting hot, cried the Prophet. He was seen to lean forward eagerly to watch as the tide of the fighting ebbed and followed. If a Bedouin tribe's fighting force did not break their enemy with that first wild charge, they seldom lingered long, for they were usually after booty or honor, not death. In a short time the Hawazin broke away and ran for their lives. Among the captives seized in the tents of the Bani Hawazin that had been pitched near the battlefield was an old Bedouin woman of the Bani Sa'd, who loudly claimed that she was the Prophet's sister. At first the Muslim soldiers merely laughed at her, but her persistence eventually won the day, and two of them escorted her to Muhammad's distinctive tent, which was made of strips of leather dyed red. He came out to greet them. The old woman stepped forward. "O Muhammad, I'm your sister," she said simply. Notice that she used his first name. She exhibits here what you will find is one of the colored threads woven into the carpet of this book, namely that peculiar mixture of affectionate respect and simple familiarity that is the charm of nomadic society. "Have you any proof of that?" Muhammad asked her, for he did not recognize her by her face. She replied by pulling up the sleeve of her dress to reveal the white scar of a bit mark on the bottom skin. "You gave me that," she said. "Do you remember one day when I was carrying you on my head through the Wadi Sirhar to join the sounds?" "Oh Muhammad, I'm your sister," she said simply. Notice that she used his first name. She exhibits here what you will find is one of the colored threads woven into the carpet of this book, namely the peculiar mixture of affectionate respect and simple familiarity that is the charm of nomadic society. "Have you any proof of that?" Muhammad asked her, for he did not recognize her by her face. She replied by pulling up the sleeve of her dress to reveal the white scar of a bite mark on the brown skin. "You gave me that," she said. "Do you remember one day when I was carrying you on my hip through the Wadi Sirhar to join the shepherds?" The Bedouin captive was indeed Dudama, his foster sister. Muhammad was overcome with joy to see her again and embraced her warmly. He spread his cloak for her in the time-honored gesture, and they sat down together. Until late into the evening they talked about their young days. Muhammad wanted to know about all that had befallen the members of his Bedouin foster family. Next morning she was sent on her way back to the desert tents, bearing gifts from Muhammad for herself and for her family. When they heard Dudama's story, the chiefs of the Banu Sa'd clan of the Banu Hawazin saw their opportunity. They approached him and said, "O Messenger of God, the woman who suckled you as a baby and looked after you as a child are of our tribe. Have pity on us, the poor people who have suffered this disaster." Which are dearest to you?" Muhammad asked. "Your children and your wives, or your flocks and herds?" "Give us back our wives and children," they said to him as one. According to the Bedouin Sunnah, after such a battle the captured women and the children were never killed or otherwise harmed. But they did risk being sold into slavery, for they belonged among the spoils of victory, at least until the Caliph Umar issued a law prohibiting the sale of Arabs into slavery. Muhammad undoubtedly had an obligation to grant the request of the Banu Sa'd chiefs, and he was scrupulous about such matters. But the Muslim warriors also expected to have their shares of the spoils of victory, which of course included the hapless Bani Sa'd men, women and children. Muhammad resolved the dilemma with considerable political acumen. He told the Banu Sa'd chiefs to wait until a large assembly of the Muslim army leaders had gathered for the nobody prayer. "We ask the messenger's intercession with the Muslims, and we ask for the Muslims' intercession with the messenger to set free our wives and children," cried out the Banu Sa'd chiefs in loud voice, following Muhammad's private instruction to the letter. The soldiers from Medina spontaneously offered their share of the prisoners to the Prophet to dispose of as he pleased. But two of the Bedouin tribal contingents, the Khuzara and Bani Tamim, flatly refused to follow their example. So did the chief of a third tribe, the Banu or the Bani Sulaym. Not so. What is ours belong to the messenger, declared the tribesmen of the Bani Sulaym, much to the chagrin of their sheikh. The debate in the assembly between the Arabs, all free and equal in the discussion, raged hotly for an hour or more. Do not underestimate the difficulties of the situation. The Bedouin have a proverb: the hawk dies with his eyes fixed on the prey. The hawk dies with his eyes fixed on the prey. Booty was the prey of the Bedouin, but they were as passionate about it as the hawk. Muhammad waited patiently for the right moment, and when it came, he was ready with just the right compromise. Whoever insists on his right to share of the prisoners should release them now, and will compensate him with 6 simple camels to every man from the next booty was. Muhammad issued no order. He told the men of the Bani Sa'd to appeal to the General Assembly of the Muslims using his practical wisdom to advise them correctly. He then showed judgment in choosing just the right time to exert his influence, for he knew the Bedouin well enough to know that 6 camels would prove more attractive to them than the burden of another wife. Notice too that he suggests to the Bani Sa'd leaders that they appeal to the Muslims to intercede with him, in other words, giving the Muslims the chance to gain honor in public by displaying their. Notice too that he suggests to the Bani Sa'd leaders that they appeal to the Muslims to intercede with him, in other words, giving the Muslims the chance to gain honor in public by displaying their magnanimity. Muhammad knew the Arab nomads. After all, he was, in Shakespeare's words, to the manner born. Another recipient of Muhammad's gifts after the battle of Hunayn was the young Bedouin Qa'id, Arabic leader Malik ibn Auf, who had hotly persuaded the Banu Hawazin chiefs to make war against the Muslims after the capture of Makkah. He had done so incidentally against the far wiser counsel of Durayd ibn Sima, the tribe's most senior chief. Durayd was a veteran Bedouin war leader. The skin of his old legs, it is said, was as thin as paper from riding here for horses bareback on so many raids. Now ailing in health, he conducted himself with the courage and dignity of a great Bedouin chief, to show that it was not cowardice, as some young hotheads had suggested, that had led him to oppose Malik's rash declaration of war against Muhammad. Durayd had himself taken to the battle in a camel litter. During the rout of the Hawazin, a young warrior of the Bani Sulaym, a Bedouin tribe fighting on the Muslim side, galloped up to the litter, seized the camel by the reins, and thrust at him with his lance in a clumsy way. "How badly has your mother reared you?" said Durayd, totally calm and self-possessed, and besides, the Bedouin were remarkably unsentimental about death, their own or another's. Durayd then proceeded to give some advice to the beginner on how to kill him. "There, take that sword hung up behind my litter and strike just between the spine and the head. It was there I used to slay the adversary in my day. Then go and tell your mother that you have killed Durayd. Many are the days in which I have saved the lives of the women of your tribe." He had indeed saved the youth's mother and his 2 grandmothers, but it earned him no mercy at Hunayn. Key points: a leader should exemplify or personify the qualities expected, required, and admired in their working groups. A leader of soldiers, for example, needs to demonstrate courage, the soldier's virtue, as Shakespeare called it. Courage is a quality shown by Muhammad at Hunayn. It is that which enables people to meet danger without giving way to fear, to act bravely under stress, or to endure in times of adversity. All members of working groups, organizations, or communities at all times in known history share one thing in common. They are all persons with a common and constant human nature. A universal leader then will be a person who exemplifies such distinctively human qualities as goodness, kindness, humanness, and compassion. Did you see any of these qualities in Muhammad? Another generic quality of universal leader is humility. The word comes from the Latin root humus, ground, earth, related to homo, man. When Muhammad spread his cloak, lowered himself, and sat on the ground with people at the same level, it was an act of humility. Compare a king sitting high upon a throne above his subjects who abase themselves before him. As they will tell you in Ghana, don't expect to be offered a chair when you visit a place where the chief himself sits on the floor. Don't expect to be offered a chair when you visit a place where the chief himself sits on the floor. It is the tribe that tells the chief how to do his job. Arab proverb. Alhamdulillah. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. In the name of Allah, most gracious, most merciful. The leadership of Muhammad. On a journey, the leader of a people is their servant. Muhammad, by John Adair. Chapter 2. The Shepherd. There is no prophet that has not worked as a shepherd. Muhammad used to say. Did you do so? Asked one present. Yes, he replied. I herded sheep as a boy. We do not know when the prophet served as a shepherd, or for how long, or for whom he worked. But in retrospect, Muhammad clearly saw this period as providential. It was almost as he saw it a necessary condition for being called as a prophet. It happened, of course, long before he knew that to be his destiny. In this chapter, I shall ask you to consider the possible lessons of leadership that Muhammad, as an intelligent and observant youth, might have gleaned from long days and nights shepherding a flock of sheep and goats in the wadis that threaded through the sun-baked hills and mountains around Mecca. Is that, I wonder, when he first came upon the cave, where later, in about the year 610, he would come for weeks to be alone with God. David was 30 years old when he began to reign over Israel, and he reigned 40 years. In the Quran, he is called a prophet, as the authorship of the book of Psalms is attributed to him. The Psalmist 78, chapter 78, verses 70 to 72, summed up his vocation in these words. He chose David his servant and took him from the sheepfolds, from tending the ewes that had young. He brought him to be the shepherd of Jacob, his people of Israel, his inheritance. With upright heart he tended them and guided them with a skillful hand. It is clear from this passage that probably the strongest ancient metaphor for a leader is that of the shepherd. Classical authors such as Homer and Xenophon had used the same image. Given our present knowledge of leadership, it is a singularly rich image. We know now that someone in a leadership role has three core and overlapping functions to achieve the tasks: to hold the group together as a unity and to meet individual needs. We know also that leadership is essentially a journey word. We know also that leadership is essentially a journey word. Putting these two insights together may help us to understand why the shepherd metaphor is so fertile in overtones and implications. It is a simple and serviceable model for a future leader, even though the lessons would have been more implicit than explicit. The shepherd gave direction to the flock by leading it from the front, sometimes walking for up to 20 miles a day in search of the sparse grass that grows in the wilderness. For even the pastures of the wilderness, Psalm 65:12, John 2:22, were welcome in the spring when the desert is green with the fresh grass and flowers that will burn up in the summer heat. Lambs naturally follow their mothers, whilst fully grown wild sheep that live in bands follow their dominant ram. To mark their paths, sheep have hoof glands that give off scent. Early humans in the Mediterranean basin, at least as long ago as 6000 BCE, observed this phenomenon, and so that docile sheep could be tamed and induced to follow a human leader instead of a ram. Shepherds in the hill country and in the wilderness had dogs, but the dogs were kept to protect the flocks of sheep and goats, and not used to round the flocks up or drive them. As a rule, shepherds go before the flock, but not infrequently they are seen behind it. Shepherds walk behind, especially in the evening when the flock is on its way to the fold, in order that they may gather the stragglers to protect them from the stealthy wolf. They may gather the stragglers, and protect them from the stealthy wolf. Shepherds also often walk by the side of the flock, somewhere around the middle of the straggling line. In the case of large flocks, the chief shepherd goes before, and the under shepherd or helper brings up the rear. Keeping the flock close together was essential for its safety. No shepherd would go so far ahead as to lose sight or be out of earshot of the sheep. The natural instinct of predators such as wolves and hyenas was to scatter the flock and then kill their individual victims. Therefore, the unity or cohesiveness of the flock was important to shepherds. If they saw a sheep or goat wandering off, they called it back. Should it still walk away, they hurled a stone from their sling so as to fall just beyond it and send it scurrying back to the flock. If a sheep became lost on the hills, Matthew 13:12, in the hills and gullies of the Judean wilderness, the shepherd had to decide whether or not to leave the flock in order to go in search of it. If several shepherds had charge of the flock if several shepherds had charge of the flock, it was easier for one to go off, but even so the departure would weaken the collective strength of the shepherds, for the main threat to the flock came more from armed raiders rather than small mountain panthers or leopards, lions, bears, jackals, hyenas, and wolves, which roamed in parts of Arabia in ancient times. The shepherd then came to personify unity, hence the proverb quoted by Jesus, "Smite the shepherd and the sheep will be scattered." Smite the shepherd and the sheep will be scattered. In order to keep their flocks safe and together at night, a time of greater danger, shepherds often herded them into the limestone caves that abound in the hills, or they made sheep folds with dry stone walls. In desert areas where stones could not be found, they constructed their folds from thorn bushes. Wolves sometimes defied the dogs and leaped over these barriers, and so shepherds might keep some of the lambs and young kids close to their tent for the night. O fairest among women, sings the author of the Song of Solomon 1:8, follow in the tracks of the flock and pasture your kids beside the shepherd's tents. Flock in Arab lands are often composed of sheep and goats, which are much more unruly than sheep alone. Goats tend to be black-white, sheep while sheep in contrast are white, as they are easy to distinguish at a distance. Goats are especially fond of nibbling young leaves, but will eat scrub, whereas sheep prefers a fresh, short grass if they can find it. But sheep and goats in mixed flocks do not always coexist happily, and the shepherd must work to keep them together harmoniously. This characteristic made it often necessary to separate the goats from the sheep in the fold. In all human groups and organizations, there are similar tendencies to internal divisiveness. The perpetual journey of shepherds and their flocks brought danger and hardship for all of them. The shepherds shared these dangers on an equal footing with the sheep. Shepherds carried no more than a bag or wallet, together with the staff and sling. The summer sun hurt or burnt shepherds and flocks by day, and all shivered in the winter snows and icy winds. Shepherds and sheep ran the risk of attacks by wild animals or of treading on deadly vipers that lurked in the limestone rocks. It is not hard to believe that the shepherds came to love their charges. Each could be recognized individually and called by name. Therefore, it is not surprising that the metaphor of the caring shepherd was applied to God. Therefore, it is not surprising that the metaphor of the caring shepherd was applied to God. The 23rd Psalm is the song of an individual sheep, a person whose every need has been met by God and the shepherd. Like all analogies, the metaphor of the shepherd for a leader of people does not break down eventually. People and sheep obviously differ in number. People and sheep obviously differ in a number of important respects, but the broad functions of leadership are contained in the image. Shepherds respond to three kinds of implicit needs present in the flock. Flocks need to find food, and so the shepherd leads them on earth to flocks need to find food, and so the shepherd leads them on the path to their desired destination. The shepherd holds them together in a cohesive and harmonious unity, and lastly, the shepherd meets their individual needs. Shepherd know each sheep or goat by name. They make sure that it finds the right food and enough water. They appoint an individual plants and sheep thorn wounds. Shepherds know each sheep or goat by name. They make sure that it finds the right food and enough water. They anoint an individual sheep's thorn wounds with oil. They tend a sick animal until it recovers strength. A joyful moment would come at sunset when the shepherd who had led out the flock of sheep in the morning brought them all safely back to the fold. It is one thing to lead people out on a journey, but it is another thing to bring them safely home. That analogy holds good for all forms of leadership. The successful leader, for example, is the one who brings the army home in safety, and if it is victorious, in triumph to a great welcome with all the joys and the celebration of such a shortcoming. For soldiers in all ages, there is no sweeter experience. Both Moses and David had worked as shepherds, and the implication is that some of the qualities and skills learned there are transferable to the leadership of people and ultimately to the nation. David guided the human flock entrusted to him by God with a skillful hand. It is difficult not to believe that in his youth Jesus also had the care of the families and neighbors' sheep and goats among the hills of Galilee, for the imagery of the shepherd informs his teaching on leadership. The Greek word for good in the saying attributed to Jesus, I am the good shepherd, John 10:14, is kalos, meaning skillful, as opposed to agathos, which means morally good. Good shepherd leaders master the skills of leadership. They know their business. There are no hirelings who will run away at the first hint of danger. If need be, they will always lay down their lives for the sheep entrusted to them. The vision of a flock of sheep without shepherd was the most powerful image in the ancient world for the need of a leader. On one of the very first clay tablets found, the words earliest writing was incised in cuneiform, a Sumerian proverb. Soldiers without a leader are like sheep without a shepherd. It seems God calls a person to become a leader of a flock through the perception of the need for leadership. Moses had responded himself to that call to become the needed leader, and in due course he appointed as his successor Joshua, a man with the Spirit in him, as one who shall go out before them and come in before them, who shall lead them out and bring them in, that the congregation of the Lord may not be as sheep which have no shepherd. Numbers 27:17. One day when Muhammad was walking with others in the shade of the date palm trees in Medina, some boys passed him carrying some baskets of arak berries. Muhammad looked at his companions. Pick me out the blackest of them, for they are sweet. He said to them, ones like that I used to gather when I fed the flocks united the flocks of Mecca at Jihad. They brought him the choicest of the fruit. Surely there has been no prophet raised up who did not do the work of a shepherd, said Muhammad once again, as if reflecting to himself. Key points: leadership is done from in front. In the human context, a human leader may not always on a physical journey be the person out in front, just as the shepherd sometimes works behind the moving flock, but spiritual leader is the one who leads from the front. In leadership, example is everything. As the Moorish proverb says, when the shepherd is corrupt, so is his flock. Apart from leading the flock to pasture and water across the wilderness, shepherds have to keep the flock together and care for each individual sheep or lamb. They will know the sheep by name, and the sheep in turn will know the shepherd's voice. A good Greek skilled shepherd meets on the level of the flock of sheep the three interactive circles of needs that are present in all human work groups at all times in history to achieve the common task to be held together as a working unity, and the needs that individuals bring into the group by virtue of being individual embodied persons. A good Greek agathos, morally good, shepherd is interested in the welfare of people, not in fleecing. When leaders are worthy of respect, the people are willing to work for them. When their virtue is worthy of admiration, their authority can be established. Alhamdulillah. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. The leadership of Muhammad. On a journey, the leader of people is their servant, Muhammad. By John Adair. Chapter 3. Caravan Leader. When traveling on a journey, even if there are only 3 of you, make one a leader. Muhammad. The Quraysh, Muhammad's tribe, were once part of a larger confederation of tribes in the Najd desert known as the Bani Kinana. As with other Bedouin tribes, it had been their custom from time immemorial to join the annual Hajj, Arabic pilgrimage to a barren valley between jagged arid mountains, where a sacred spring called Zamzam brought its cold, clear water to the surface. Nearby stood an unusual standing stone, black meteorite, that the ancestors of the Bedouin may have worshipped once as a god. In Muhammad's day, they would touch or kiss the venerated black stone, Arabic al-Hajar al-Aswad, before sacrificing an animal. In the course of time, this holy place came to be known as, in Arabic, as Mecca. The form of that word used by Ptolemy c. 90 to 168 CE. Makoraba gives us its meaning, for in several Semitic languages it signifies a temple. We think of a temple as a large building in the Egyptian or Greco-Roman form, but a temple in the early Semitic context is simply an enclosure, a low wall made of stones or rocks around a holy city or a holy site, initially built to keep stray animals away. The black stone was eventually protected, probably for the same reason, by the Kaaba, Arabic the cube. Qusay was a chief of the Quraysh. While they still lived in the desert, he happened to marry the daughter of a chief of the Bani Khuza'a tribe, who had installed himself as the guardian of the temple of Makkah. On his father-in-law's death, aided by his Bani Kinana kinsmen from the desert, Qusay overcame his Khuzan rivals, Khuza'a rivals, and took charge of Makkah. The Khuzan were driven out, packing their tents onto their camels. They returned to the nomadic life in the Najd in the Najd from whence they had come. It was Qusay who built the first stone dwelling house around the temple enclosure and began to manage the annual pilgrimage, partly for profit. He levied a tax on his fellow tribesmen to support poor or needy pilgrims, which doubtless brought him great prestige among the desert tribes who so much valued generous hospitality. Muhammad's grandfather Abdul Muttalib, who had looked after him for 2 years when he was orphaned, was a great grandson of Qusay. Here is his noble message to his fellow tribesmen: you are God's neighbor, the people of his temple and sanctuary. The pilgrims are God's guests and visitors to his temple, and they have the highest claim on your generosity, so provide food and drink for them during their pilgrimage until they depart out of your territory. With their institution of a ban on all warfare and violence in the region around Mecca during the annual pilgrimage, the Quraysh also in effect gave their protection to the devout wayfarers who converged in large crowds on the holy place. Mecca was one of a number of small commercial and agricultural towns in the hilly areas of the Hijaz in Western Arabia. There were settled communities too in the great date-growing oases of Yemen on the Gulf Coast. Most of these towns and markets were mainly used for the exchange of the wool and leather of the pastoralist and for the grain, olive oil and wine that were the main luxuries. From about 500, however, the mining of precious metals in the Hijaz added a new dimension. Some of the mines were owned and operated by Bedouin tribes like the Bani Sulaim. The production of precious metals greatly increased the prosperity of the area. At least some of the Bedouin tribes now had the means to become important consumers of the produce of the settled lands. Groups of merchants emerged to import goods from Syria, setting up networks between the tribes to allow their caravans to pass in peace. As the decades passed, the settled Arabs, the occupants of the small towns and villages that grew around a well or oasis, Arabia has no rivers, became more distinct from their Bedouin cousins, the desert nomads. They prided themselves on the virtue of hilm, that included such qualities as gentleness, clemency, mildness, and forbearance. They considered the Bedouin tribes to be excitable and unreliable, useful for their military skills in desert warfare, and for their hardiness, but needing to be controlled and led. For their part, many of the Bedouin tribal chiefs, without surrendering any of their essential freedom and independence, proved to be willing to accept the leadership of the high status tribes in the town, such as the Quraysh in Mecca and the Thaqif in nearby Taif, when occasion demanded it. A modern example of the same principle arose in the First World War, when the Sharif of Mecca and his 4 sons, direct descendants of the Prophet and of Muhammad's clan and the Quraysh, the Hashemites, led the Arab revolt against their Turkish overlords, supported and largely funded by their British and French allies. The Sharifian army under Faisal, which entered Damascus in 1918, consisted of a small force of Arab soldiers drawn from the towns, mostly deserters from the Turkish army, and a much more numerous horde of Bedouin tribesmen recruited from the different tribes along the road to Damascus. For example, the famous chief of the Bani Huwaitat, Auda Abu Fai, whom we shall meet again in the next chapter, led his tribesmen in the capture of the port of Aqaba, the turning point of the campaign, and the survival of those sons, Abdullah and his son Hussein, as king of Jordan, depended more than once upon that ancient willingness of the Bedouin tribes to give their personal loyalty to leaders descended from the Prophet tribe. Muhammad revered his grandfather. You may recall that at the Battle of Hunayn, in the Arab manner, he shouted, out as his personal war cry, "I am Muhammad, son of Abdul Muttalib." Abdul Muttalib was a chief or sheikh in the great tradition, one who personified the virtues that Arabs valued and expected in their leaders. One of the poets commissioned to compose and recite eulogies in his honor sang of him, "Alas, has the shepherd of his people, the generous one, perished, who gave the pilgrims their water, the defender of our fame, who used to carry the wandering guest into his tents when the heavens begrudged their rain." Notice that image of the shepherd of his people returning here like a musical refrain. Did Muhammad as a boy dream of being such a shepherd? Thanks to long-standing quarrels between the various kinship groups and lineages, the Quraysh had no acknowledged single tribal chief. In that respect, perhaps they could be seen as a flock without a shepherd. This lack of strong leadership, however, would work to Muhammad's advantage later on, when the Quraysh lacked a leader of sufficient stature and wisdom to deal with the man who became the thorn in their side. By a set of complex established precedent, the leading Qurayshi families shared between them the functions of leadership. They divided up such responsibilities as the guardianship of the temple, the maintenance of the house of meeting that stood near the enclosure, the right to carry the tribal banner in battle, the collection of the charitable tax to provide hospitality and succor for the poorest pilgrims, and the arranging of the divinations that took place before the idols of the various tribal gods, such as Hubal, that now also stood within the large sacred enclosure. Decisions of importance were made by the heads of lineages by reaching consensus in the time-honored manner of the Bedouin Majlis, Arabic place of sitting from Jalasa to be seated, with its sides open to the winds. Their one-story house of meeting next to the temple was simply a Bedouin chief's tent of meeting made out of stone. Under Islam, much later, a majlis came to mean a public audience granted by a ruler such as a caliph, sultan, or emir, but it retained its sense as a public forum for the conduct of political matters or legal judgments. What in English would come to be called a parliament, from the French parler to speak the original sense of the word, was the action of speaking, speech, conference, or discussion. Hence, the council called by a monarch to discuss some matter of general importance. Without any police force at his disposal, a chief depended upon his personal authority, the strength of his personality, and the wisdom of his judgments to lead where he could not command. Charles Doughty, the 19th century English traveler in Arabia, once described in his distinctive prose style the Majlis of Sheikh Mutlaq, the chief of the Fuqara tribe. When the Majlis assembled numerous at his tent, he, the great Sheikh and host, would set out with a proud humility among the common people, holding still his looks at the ground, but they were full of unquiet side glances as his mind was erect and watching. His authority slumbered till there being some just occasion. He ruled with word the unruly Bidu. The sheikh of a nomad tribe is not tyrant. A great sheikh striking a tribesman, he should bruise his own honor. In fact, guiding such a meeting to an actionable decision required not only the authority of position and personal prestige, but also skill. Do you imagine Muhammad as a boy ever sitting on the edge of the open-sided meeting house in order to learn that skill? I do. A more modern tribal example may illustrate that possibility. Nelson Mandela's father, a chief of the Thimbo tribe, used to take him as a young boy in the great place where the paramount chief Mokezwani used to discuss tribal issues with tribal chiefs and any Thimbos who wished to attend. The leader of leaders was surrounded by his counselors. Mandela later recalled, "My later notions of leadership were profoundly influenced by observing the paramount chief. My later notions of leadership were profoundly influenced by observing the paramount chief. I watched and learned from the tribal meetings that were regularly held at the great place, and as a leader I have always followed the principles I first saw demonstrated there. I have always endeavored to listen to what each and every person in a discussion had to say before venturing my own opinion. Oftentimes my own opinion will simply represent a consensus of what I heard in the discussion. Maybe when he was 14, Muhammad was present at the Majalis when the Quraysh chiefs decided to join in a war that had erupted in the desert. Some Bani Hawazin tribesmen had raised a caravan near Mecca and killed the guide. He came from the Bani Kinana and the caravan was under the tribe's protection. To make matters worse, this fatal assault took place in the month before the great annual pilgrimage to Mecca, when any violence in the environs of the town was strictly forbidden. Consequently, a war broke out between the two tribes that lasted 5 years, and it is out and broke out between the two tribes that lasted 5 years, and it is not difficult to guess what side the Meccans were on. Muhammad accompanied his uncles in the Meccan contingent to one battle, and it is said that he made himself useful by picking up spent arrows on the field afterwards. This story illustrates how the Meccans could not have isolated themselves from desert politics even if they had wanted to do so, and there would be no better way for Muhammad to get to know desert politics than by becoming a caravan leader. And it is speculation on my part, no more, that as a young man he may well have done so. The Quraysh were in the business of caravans, for they were merchants. They carried on trade on a large scale with Syria in the north and Yemen in the south. Their caravans to and from Damascus had to complete a journey of 1,000 miles. They carried, among other things, dyed and finally worked leather goods made from skins obtained from the Bedouin tribes, often at the great fairs held at pilgrimage time. Every large caravan was headed by Qa'id, pronounced Qa'id in Arabic. That word could be applied to a guide, the leader of a raid on another tribe's camel, or military commander. The commander of the Bedouin regiment of the Arab Legion in which I served when I was 20 had that title. Qiyada, leadership. Arabic has no infinitive, derives from the Arab word yaqud, meaning he leads. A derivative is miqwad, a rope that is used to lead a horse or camel by the head. Strictly speaking, however, no one in Arabia's society would presume to call themselves a qad or leader. Originally, at any rate, it was more like an accolade or compliment. The same applies incidentally to leader in English. It is interesting to see how close the Arabic and English languages are at this point, meaning a roadway, path, or course of a ship at sea. The Anglo-Saxon word lead is the root of the English words leadership, and to lead. It is related to the verb leiden, to go or travel, or in its causative form, to make or cause to go. In fact, it is a North European root with similar sounding equivalents in Old Norse, German, and Dutch. Clearly, leadership is a journey concept. A leader literally is one who leads the way by going first, the one too who may cause or make others to go on a journey and holds them together in a body so that they do not get out of touch or lose their unity as a body. Remember the shepherd. The ship ending of leadership derives from the Anglo-Saxon verb to shape, known as a suffix in English. The ship word ending has two distinct meanings, and that can be a bit confusing. Here it can mean 1, an office, dignity, a position or position of a leader. 2, the qualities or attributes of being a leader. The distinction becomes clearer, and it is observed that not all those who occupy roles or positions of leadership by birth, election, or equipment have the personal ability and knowledge of how to lead. Plutarch, for example, described a Roman emperor named Gaius Antoninus as a man with no aptitude for leadership in any direction, either good or bad. The Africans have a proverb to describe such a ruler. A log of food may lie in the river for years, but it never becomes a crocodile. A log of wood may lie in the river for years, but it never becomes crocodile. You can be appointed a commander or manager, it has been said, but you are not a leader until your appointment is ratified in the hearts and minds of those you lead. Perhaps it was while leading caravans that Muhammad discovered that he had a natural gift for leadership. Okay, what do you think? Alhamdulillah. The role of a caravan leader was an exceptionally responsible one. Before the caravan left Mecca, for example, 100 or more camels and camel drivers had to be selected and hired. The loads assembled and packed for the camels, provisions and tents bought and loaded, weapons prepared, and money secured for expenses en route and for the wages of the camel drivers. Once you in the desert and the tracks leading north, all accountability for the caravan rested solely on the shoulders of the caravan leader. He was without any means of communication with the owners once Mecca had receded from sight, nor was the caravan insured. If any property in his care was damaged or stolen, it was the caravan leader and his kinsfolk who were obliged to recompense the owners. The Bedouin tribes made part of their money by extracting protection money from caravans that passed through their territory. Therefore, a key function of a caravan leader was negotiating with the right tribe for the right amount of money or goods. The desert nomads respected noble lineage. Therefore, the best guarantee for the security of a caravan as it plodded its way through the wilderness was the personal heritage of its chosen leader, and the respect engendered by the fact that he was a member of a distinguished family in Mecca. As you would expect, the qa'id of a caravan always accompanied it in person. The great Byzantines in Muhammad's day called a caravan leader a synodiarch. The word literally means a chief ruler or leader of a meeting or council. In Palmyra, a great oasis and city in northern Arabia, a group of Palmyrene merchants erected a monument in 1930 CE to a caravan leader who had won their gratitude. The inscription reads, "This statue is in honor of Tay Marsu, chief of the caravan, Synodiac, which has been made for him by members of the caravan who came up with him from Charax, because he paid their expenses, 300 gold coins in ancient currency, and was well pleasing to them." On a journey, Muhammad once said, "The leader of a people is their servant." What did he mean? That a true leader serves those whom he or she leads, both as a group, meeting their needs to complete their journey safely, and their needs to be maintained as a cohesive whole, and also as a set of individuals. For each individual on a journey may have small needs or problems as the journey proceeds. Would you like to see Muhammad as a servant leader in action? Fortunately, we can. Wahab ibn Kaysan once accompanied Muhammad on a raid. When they set out from Medina, he was riding an old feeble camel. It is he who tells the following story. On the way back, the company kept going on while I dropped farther behind until the apostle overlooked me and asked me what the trouble was. I told him that my camel was keeping me back, and he told me to make it kneel. I did so, and the apostle made his camel kneel. "Give me the stick you are holding, or cut a stick from a tree," he said. Wahab could not quite remember which. He took it and prodded the beast with it a few times. Then he told me a mount, and off we went. By him who sent him with the truth, my old camel kept as up with the rapid pace of his she camel. As we were talking, the apostle asked me if I would sell him my camel. I said that I would give him it, but he insisted on buying it. So I asked him to make me an offer. He said he would give me a dirham. I refused and said that would be cheating me. Then he offered 2 dirhams, and I still refused, and the apostle still went on raising his offer until it amounted to an ounce of gold. When I asked him if he was really satisfied, he said that he was, and I said the camel was his. Then he asked me if I were married. Then was she a virgin or a woman previously married? I told him she had been married before. No girl, so that you could sport together. No girl, so that you could sport together. He said, I told him that my father had been killed at Uhud, leaving 7 daughters, and I had married a motherly woman who could look after them efficiently. You have done well, if God will, he said. Had we come to Sirar, a place about 3 miles from Medina, we would order camels to be slaughtered and stay there for the day, and she would hear about us and shake the dust of her cushions. But by God, we have no conclusions. I replied, but you will leave, the Prophet said, and added, when you return, behave wisely. When we got to Sirar, the apostle ordered the camels to be slaughtered, and we stayed there for the day. At night, the apostle went home, and so did we. I told the woman the news and what the apostle had said to me. Look alive and do what he tells you. In the morning, I led away the camel and made it kneel at the apostle's door. Then I sat inside the mosque hard by. He came out and saw it and asked what it was, and they told him it was the camel which I had brought. He asked where I was, and I was summoned to him. O son of my brother, he said, take away your camel, for it is yours. And he called Bilal and told him to give me an ounce of gold. Bilal was a former slave when Muhammad had appointed as the first muaddin, the person appointed to call Muslims to prayer. He gave Wahb the ounce of gold, and Muhammad added a little more gold to it. What is remarkable about this story is first that the prophets noticed the young man struggling on the old camel and stopped to help them. He enjoyed playfully haggling for the camel which he had no intention of buying, and in the process finding out more about Wahb as the son of a fallen hero at Uhud, son of my brother. He was a worthy recipient of the generous gift. That ends the story. Muhammad has behaved as a great Arab chief should, but with a characteristically gentle and humorous touch. Key points. Muhammad looked up to his grandfather Abdul Muttalib, briefly his father as well. He personified what the Arabs called Muru'ah, the virtue of being a man. It connotes a cluster of virtues: bravery, generosity, practical wisdom, and honor, all highly valued. These are the qualities we see in Muhammad. Practical wisdom, the Greeks called it phronesis, is essentially the art of knowing the right thing to do at the right time and in the right way. It encompasses the ability to see ahead, to predict how things will unfold, and also to forecast what will be the consequences of a given course of action. Being a caravan leader, being a leader in any context, calls for such a judgment or practical wisdom. The ability to come to sound conclusions, to make wise decisions based upon them, and to act upon them with decisive and determination. No one is born wise. A leader becomes wise, acquires practical wisdom through working. No one is born wise. A leader becomes wise, acquires practical wisdom through mutual aptitude, practice, and reflection. Wisdom, like an Arab bow made of different kinds of food, has the 3 elements: intelligence, experience, and goodness. The caravan leader is not the caravan's official guide or daily or dalil who piloted the camel train through his knowledge of the landmarks. The qa'id fulfilled the generic or universal role of leader, achieving the task successfully, maintaining group coherence or unity, and caring for individual members. meeting these three areas of interactive or overlapping need called for skill, but it was best performed in a spirit of service. Served to lead. Muhammad learned that great lesson. For an example of the humble service he rendered to a companion on a journey when he was the leader, see above. On a journey. Alhamdulillah. End of chapter 3.